So, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Sushil Vijay, your faculty of orthopedics at DBMCI, and today I'm going to discuss with you certain important topics, certain important questionnaires which are a part of your INI CT exam all the time, right? So most of these are the topics which are repeated frequently. Questions obviously will be changed, the conditions obviously will be changed, but yes, the main crux, the main idea behind that particular question, it remains same all the time. Okay, so I've just accumulated some few, very few questions for you so that we can have an idea of everything which is important for these particular examinations. Let's see the questions. So number one I have kept here is a patient had history of trauma to the elbow 2 years back and treated conservatively somewhere. Now presenting with the deformity as shown. So most likely injury was. Now I would request you all, so please focus on the content, right? So please focus on the topic, the topic which as a whole we want to discuss, not just the language of the question. They are not, supposed to give you the language like this, but yes, the topic deformity as such is very important. Okay, so when you talk about the deformity, let's first solve this question and then come on to the other things as well, which I want you to remember when you are going in your exam. So this patient had history of trauma to the elbow some 2 years back. So something wrong with the elbow, treated conservatively, now presenting with this complaint which is shown in the image. So what do you observe in this image? So you can observe that when you see the long axis of the arm and this forearm, it is slightly invalgus, which is a normal thing. But when you talk about the other side, the left side, the humerus, the arm is like this, but the forearm, the part of the limb distal to the joint is going medially. So what kind of deformity do we suspect here? It's what we call the cubitus varus deformity, isn't it? The elbow, so cubitus, and varus, because the part of the limb distal to the joint is going medially. So that's what we call a cubitus varus deformity. Now with which injury it is associated, we all know. It's very common one, that is supracondylar humerus, right? So supracondylar humerus is related to your cubitus varus deformity. Now once we are talking about the deformity, I would like you to remember the other conditions as well in which other deformities are seen. For example, let me mention a few of them. The deformity part, what I want you to remember, just a quick recall of all the important things. So in deformities, number one, when I talked about the cubitus varus, we have already seen that the cubitus varus will be related to what condition? It will be related to your malunited supracondylar fracture humerus. Malunited fracture, supracondylar humerus, right? Similarly, if you are given an image in which the forearm is going deviated laterally, then what do we call it? Then it will be your cubitus valgus, and that cubitus valgus is related to usually the non-union, because that's a fracture of necessity, the fracture of lateral condyle of humerus. So malunited supracondylar humerus leading to varus usually, and the non-union fracture lateral condyle humerus leading to valgus usually. Okay. Number three, when you talk about the deformities which are otherwise important, again, the hip, the coxa vara. What does that mean? Coxa vara, when the neck shaft angle decreases, isn't it? So now when you are appearing for the INI CT, I do believe that the basics, the angle, the decrease, the normal things, they are already in your mind. I'm just revising the conditions in which we see this. Okay. So coxa vara is usually related to your fracture neck of femur. Can be related to conditions like rickets. Can be related to conditions like malacia. They are bending, the softening of the bones, and the conditions, the tumors like fibrous dysplasia. What do we call when the cubitus varus occurs in fibrous dysplasia? Remember that? That is what we call as the Shepherd crook deformity. Remember the bending of the head of the femur, the Shepherd crook deformity, right? Then other condition which can have coxa vara is SCFE, slipped capital femoral epiphysis, right? Now number four, when you talk of the angle which is increasing, so I want you to remember that Gardens type 1, the fracture neck of femur classification, Gardens type 1, what was that kind of fracture? The incomplete fracture, which is valgus impacted fracture, and the trabecular pattern in the neck is not aligned because the head is going into what? Valgus. So Gardens type 1 fracture neck of femur is usually related to coxa valga deformity of the hip. When you come on to the knee area, the genu varum and genu valgum. So genu varum, you all know that. Just a very quick recap. Which kind of joint disorder? When you have the medial compartment OA. When you have a patient who is having a medial compartment osteoarthritis, right? Or in which other conditions? In conditions like rickets. So when a child is born, we know that physiologically there is a varum deformity, and the angle usually also is varus. And the other pathological condition which can be related to genu varum can be the Blount's disease. Remember from pediatric orthopedics? The Blount's disease, the tibia vara, right? Similarly, for genu valgum, we have the lateral compartment osteoarthritis. For genu valgum, we have the lateral compartment osteoarthritis. Okay, and then obviously malunited fractures can be a reason for any kind of deformity anywhere, right? Then number 7, I want you to remember the deformity of hallux, the hallux valgus, which has been a frequently asked question in your AIIMS exam. So the lateral deviation of the great toe is what you call hallux valgus. The medial deviation of the great toe is what we call varus. The hallux, the MTP. Okay, so these are the deformities. And one other deformity which I want you to remember, that is learned by the name of Haglund's prominence or the Haglund's deformity, which is seen in calcaneum. Remember that when the posterior part of the calcaneum is here, normal smooth, and the tendo Achilles is attached. When it keeps on pulling it up, the calcaneum develops a sharp projection like this. What do you call that? Haglund's deformity. So deformity, remember the deformities around the joint, remember the deformity of the calcaneum, the Haglund's, and the condition with which they are associated. So this is about the deformity, just simply around the joints. Other than these, I want you to remember other deformities as well. What are the other deformities as well? This is hallux valgus related to commonly conditions of rheumatoid arthritis. Related to rheumatoid arthritis, right? Now, when you talk about these are joint deformities, the other deformities which I just started telling you, the other deformities. So this is one I told you, the prominence of the back of the calcaneum is what you call the Haglund's deformity, right? Which was a very, very, important question was asked in your AIIMS a couple of years back. Then when you talk about the fingers, what all deformities we can see in the fingers? When you talk of the fingers, in the patients of rheumatoid arthritis, we can see two typical deformities in the fingers. One is swan neck and one is the buttonhole deformity or the botonier deformity. Remember them? The botonier deformity or the swan neck. So swan neck will be flexion here at the last joint and hyperextension here at the proximal IP joint. Botonier will be opposite, the flexion at the proximal IP joint and the extension at the distal IP joint. Okay, so RA, the swan neck deformity and the botonier deformity, the typical deformities. Then when you move on to the wrist area, what all deformities we can expect to have in our exams? One, at the wrist, when it is a condition of a child, then we can have something known as the Madelung's deformity. Then we can have a Madelung's deformity. What is that Madelung's deformity? Do you recall? Do you remember? When the distal part of the radius from its medial sides, usually from the palmar aspect, it fails to develop, it fails to grow. So what happens? The articulation area of the ulna will be lost and the ulna subluxate dorsally. So it gives you an appearance of something known as the dinner fork deformity. So another deformity which can be seen as a part of fractures is dinner fork deformity. So where do we see dinner fork deformity? What do we observe in dinner fork deformity? The Colles fracture, malunited, right? So dorsal deviation, the dorsal displacement of the fragment, distal fragment, it is leading to dinner fork deformity, right? Then other we have is the Smith fracture leading to what kind of deformity here on the wrist? It is what we call the garden spade deformity. So the garden spade deformity. So these are around the wrist, right? So the joint conditions, the developmental conditions which are leading to the deformities. Then when I talk about other deformities as well, please do remember the other conditions, the last one which are related to your nerves. For example, when you talk about the deformities which are related to the nerves, with the problems of the nerves in the hand, we have got the claw hand. We have the claw hand, which can be the ulnar claw, median claw, or the complete claw hand basically, or the wrist drop or the finger drop. Wrist drop or the finger drop. So we do know that the wrist drop is because of the radial nerve, and radial nerve is most commonly involved where? The flexure shaft of the humerus. Finger drop is because of the posterior interosseous nerve, which is most commonly involved whenever there is involvement of the head of radius, for example in Monteggia fractures, right? So these are all the commonly asked deformities which we can have in our exam. So do remember each one of them. right? So this was your deformity part. I believe that you know already, and this is just a brush up of all the things that we already have in our mind. Okay, let's move on to the number 2. The second one we have is the middle finger of a sports person is showing a flexion deformity at the distal IP joint after his match. So again, a question of deformity, but then it is not related to any, the congenital condition or any kind of the malunion, but now there is some sort of injury. Probably a sports person after his match is noticing a deformity that the finger is held in a state of flexion. Now, most likely it can be due to involvement of what? It can be involvement of FDP, flexor digitorum profundus. So if the FDP would have been a damage, there is a rupture of the FDP, what will happen? If the FDP gets damaged, it is causing or helping out the flexion of the IP joint. So if FDP, I suppose, is damaged, the finger should be in extension, not in flexion, isn't it? So this doesn't seem the option. Median nerve. So median nerve will lead to a kind of, you can say, the deformity of the finger, but why only the middle finger? It should be involvement of the index finger, the thumb also. So less likely. Extensor tendon. So the extensor tendon which is coming over here and getting attached to the distal phalanx here is ruptured. And when the extensor tendon is ruptured, what will happen? The finger will be held in flexion, right? So what exactly is that? This is what you call mallet finger. This is what we call a mallet finger. I hope everybody remembers that, the mallet finger. So mallet finger is the avulsion of the extensor tendon from the distal phalanx. That's what we call a mallet finger. So when you talk about these kind of deformities or simple conditions, the injuries in the hand, the soft tissues, ligamentous, I want you to learn or remember 3 important conditions. One is this mallet finger, which is avulsion of this extensor tendon from the distal phalanx. Second, I want you to remember is the Skyer's thumb or the gamekeeper's thumb. Second one is the Skyer's thumb or the gamekeeper's thumb. What exactly is that? Now remember this Skyer's thumb or the gamekeeper's thumb question can be asked to you in a very, very, clinically oriented way. They might give you a scenario that patient was, skying and then he tries to hold on to a pole, or he was trying to catch a ball without the gloves and like that. And then he got a sudden hyperextension of the thumb. This area that get into hyperextended, it became hyperextended, and then suddenly what happened? All the ligaments here, they got damaged. So what exactly is this Skyer's thumb or the gamekeeper's thumb? The injury to the ulnar collateral ligament of the thumb, isn't it? Injury to ulnar collateral ligament of thumb is what we call the Skyer's thumb or the gamekeeper's thumb. Then other condition I want you to recall here from the hand area is the jersey finger. What exactly is that jersey finger? When you ask the patient to, flex all the fingers, one of the finger in which there is an injury to flexor digitorum profundus, it will remain extended, something like this, and rest of the fingers will show you flexion. So this extension here at the last joint, that is at the distal interphalangeal joint, which is being flexed by the flexor digitorum profundus, when this remains extended, it means that there is an injury to the FDP. So jersey finger, Skyer's thumb or the gamekeeper's thumb, and the mallet finger that we just saw. 3 important conditions you must remember. Okay. Then other one I kept for you. A patient came to the emergency room following RTA. On arrival, his right lower limb was in the given posture. What can be the most likely cause? Now, there are, multiple questions which are asked to you just by giving you a hint of the attitude of the limb. So I want you to remember the attitude of the limb in all the important conditions that we read, right? For example, if I talk about this particular condition, I know that the RTA has happened and now the patient is keeping the hip joint in this extended state and abducted state and externally rotated state. You can see that. So when the patient is keeping the hip in an abducted and externally rotated state, external rotation and abducted state, I know that there are certain conditions which are very, very, common. For example, if I just talk of external rotation can be seen with the fracture intertrochanteric, extracapsular fracture, more of external rotation, but then why abduction, right? Then hip in external rotation and abduction can be a part of dislocations also, isn't it? So we have option of 3 types of dislocation, all the 4 types of dislocation mentioned here: inferior, posterior, interior, central. So in the hip, we only have 3 these dislocations. There is nothing like an inferior dislocation. Either it is a central one, or it is an anterior one, or it is a posterior one. We have 3 kind of dislocation only. Okay. So you must remember, recall the attitude of the limb in different, conditions. Now I'll just help you out to revise or recall the attitude of different conditions with the help of this particular chart, right, which I've just written by hand. So when the hip is in abduction and external rotation only, what are the possibilities? The possibility is of anterior dislocation of the hip. The possibility is of anterior dislocation of the hip. So please do remember, whenever there is an anterior dislocation of the hip, what all other important points we should remember? They are that the injured structure can be the vessels in the groin. They are femoral vessels, right? So there can be injury to the femoral vessels. If the hip joint is held in adduction and internally rotated state, close to the midline and internally rotated, it can be very well a posterior dislocation where we have shortening, and the injured structure can be a sciatic nerve. Do remember these important things. Everything remains connected. Every time the topics remain same, the question out of them, it is changed, right? The way of asking you is changed. If there is an adduction deformity or in the neutral position with shortening, it can be very well a case of central flexure dislocation, because the head of the femur has to perforate the acetabulum and get into the pelvic cavity. Then, if it is a flexion, abduction and external rotation, not the extension now, flexion, abduction and external rotation, then it is in the stage of synovitis. Now, this synovitis can be related to multiple conditions. For example, the first stage of tuberculosis. For example, the initial phase of Perthes disease. For example, any inflammatory condition. These will be, the synovial stages, the synovitis stages. If the hip is held in the stage of, flexion, adduction and internal rotation, that suggests you that now the bony destruction has started and now the muscle is pulling the bone up. This is usually seen in the tubercular hip in the stage 2, 3 and 4, the early arthritis, late arthritis and the advanced arthritis, where you see the wandering acetabulum. And what is the broad difference between the early and the late arthritis? The broad difference is, in late arthritis, there will be true shortening of the limb. Okay, so there will be true shortening of the limb. Then, if it is only externally rotated, there are two conditions possible. Either it can be a fracture neck of femur or it can be IT fracture, or if I tell you in a more simplified way, it can be an intracapsular fracture or an extracapsular fracture. So when it is an extracapsular fracture, it will be more externally rotated, that is more than 45 degrees. So it is extracapsular fracture, for example, intertrochanteric fracture. If it is less than 45 degrees, then it is fracture neck of the femur, right? Then adduction and external rotation, one of the very, very important, topic which is asked from pediatric orthopedics very commonly. When the patient is having a external rotation of the limb with adduction, there are two conditions possible. One, it is a usual condition, it is a usual presentation in Perthes, and the second condition is SCFE, slipped capital femoral epiphysis. Both the conditions can have the same attitude, the Perthes and the SCFE. Perthes and SCFE. So these are the condition in which the hip will be held in the stage of adduction, severe muscular spasm and bony destruction, and external rotation, synovial inflammation. Okay, so remember this. When I look at this particular image, I can see I spoke that wrong, that it is extended, it is flexed. Okay, so this flexed state and the external rotation of the limb, what is that telling me? So whenever there is a flexion, external rotation and away from the midline, that is abducted. So abduction, external rotation is usually related to what kind of dislocation? It is your anterior dislocation of the hip. So I want you to remember the attitudes of the limb in any of the dislocations or in any of the mentioned conditions. Similar to the hip, when I said about this similar to the hip, when I talk of the upper limb also, when the upper two mentioned criteria, the adduction and internal rotation and abduction and external rotation, these will be similar to your shoulder dislocation also. So I have here in this particular table, I have just mentioned the attitude of the hip. So you can very, very, easily recall all the conditions, because most of the time we have seen that they will give you a hint by the means of this attitude of the hip only. So please be very, very, vigilant while you see these attitudes in the images being given. In the previous years, you might have seen that they have given you, in fact, the questions which are asking you the movements of the hip, internal rotation, external rotation, and these are the attitudes that you must remember. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Identify the test being performed in the below image. Now, what was the idea behind this, test, the image to put here? Because every year we see that there is a test-based question which is asked in the AIIMS exam, right? So what exactly is that? The patient is lying supine, and then we are trying to flex this hip. Okay, so this is what we are trying to do is a Thomas test. And why do we do Thomas test? Let's see some of the commonly asked tests, commonly learned tests in orthopedics. So I'll just start doing, this is, okay. Okay, fine. So I'll start from this particular test, which will be because of, we are starting from the neck area and the upper limb, then the lower limb. So thoracic outlet syndrome. What are the tests that I want you to remember or recall from here? Thoracic outlet syndrome. What exactly is that thoracic outlet syndrome? It means that either because of a cervical rib or because of the clavicle and between the scalene muscle, usually the scalene medius, the neurovascular structures may be compromised. It can be a part of the subclavian vessels. It can be a part of the brachial plexus. So it can be anything like these vessels you can see. The scalenus medius here, the anterior and the medius, in between them you can have compression of the brachial plexus, and then this clavicle here and the muscles, you can have a compression of the subclavian vessels here, right? So vein and artery can be visible. So this is what we call the thoracic outlet syndrome. So thoracic outlet is not only the nerval or neural structure compression. It can be a vessel, which can be an artery or a vein, and can give you different results, right? What are the tests which are being done? Test number 1 is what we call Addison test. So what we do in Addison test? In Addison test, it is again the Addison test or the Roos test. These are the tests for thoracic outlet syndrome. So Addison test, what we do in this, the patient is asked to stand straight or maybe asked to sit. The arm, the shoulder, basically, it will be abducted to 30 degrees and extended. Okay. So the shoulder will be 30 degrees abducted and extended. Then you ask the patient to extend the neck, right, and rotate to the side on which you are trying to check. So extend the neck and rotate the neck, and once you do so, feel the radial pulse, right? So if there is a tendency for the neurovascular compromise, what will happen? The radial pulsations will become weak. This is what you call Addison test. Okay, so Addison test, abduct 30 degrees, extend the shoulder, extend the neck, rotate the neck. It will compress the subclavian vessels. It will lead to decrease in pulsations on the radial artery. Okay, that is one. Second test I mentioned is what you call the Roos test. What exactly is Roos test? This Roos test is done with the arm held in abduction and external rotation like this. You ask the patient to, clench his fist and close his fist again and again and again like this. Okay, so 3 minutes is the usual duration. Some people say 1 to 3 minutes should be done. So 3 minutes is the usual duration when the patient is asked to keep the hand like this and, just pump up his fists, clenches his fist. Okay, so what all possibilities are there? What can happen? So there can be a paresthesia in the forearm and finger. What is that suggestive of? The brachial plexus compression. There can be arterial compression, which will lead to decrease in blood flow to the limbs. There can be venous compression, which will lead to cyanosis and swelling of the limb. There can be a numbness in the 3 fingers, these 3 fingers, which is suggestive of the carpal tunnel syndrome or the compression simply of the median nerve. Or there can be severe pain in the neck and the shoulders, which is suggestive that there might be a cervical disc prolapse. So there are multiple impressions which are possible with this particular test, which is known as the Roos test. So Roos and Addison, do remember they are for the thoracic outlet syndrome. Then we can have another, this test, I just want to tell you that this test is also known as the EAST test, that is elevated stress arm, the elevated arm stress test, the EAST test. Okay. Then you have got another test for the arterial competency, that is known as the Allen's test. So you all know that Allen's test is done for the patency of the radial, if you want to just check whether the radial artery is blocked or no. So you just check it like this. In the case of radial artery thrombosis suspected, so you compress the ulnar and the radial, and then you open them one by one to see which arterial circulation is working in your hand. That is what you call Allen's test. Okay. Then you have certain other tests like this Hoover's test, which was asked in your exam. What is that Hoover's test? Hoover's test help you to differentiate between a paresthetic limb. Basically when you don't have any kind of power in the limb to differentiate it from the normal limb, right? So organic cause versus inorganic or a malingering cause, that is what you came to know by this Hoover's test. So how to do this Hoover sign? Hoover sign is basically a motor sign, right? And it is suggestive or based on the principle of extensor cross reflex. How it is done? The examiner will elevate one of the leg and he will keep his, the fist under his one of the heel. Then he asks the patient to put some pressure on it. So on the side, the limb which is normal, the patient will be able to, press it down. But on the side, there is paresthesia, there is paresis. The patient won't be able to put any kind of pressure on the wrist or the hand of the examiner. That's what you call the Hoover's test, right? So this is done to differentiate between the organic and the inorganic cause of a lower back ache or the weakness of the lower limb basically, right? So based on the principle of crossed extensor reflex. This is Hoover's test. Another test I want you to remember is what you call the Thompson test. It is Thompson test. What is that Thompson test? Thompson test is done to see the patency of the tendo Achilles. It is done to see the patency of the tendo Achilles. How it is done? The patient will be lying prone, right? So you just squeeze the calf like this. Normally what should happen when you squeeze the calf, it will contract your tendo Achilles and the foot automatically goes back like this. But when there is a tear of the tendo Achilles here, when you squeeze the calf, the foot remains stagnant. It doesn't move. That's what you call Thompson test. Other than these tests, there are 2 to 3 other tests which I want you to remember. One is what we call as the lift off test in the upper limb. The lift off test in upper limb. And why do we do that? The lift off test, it is done for subscapularis. Right? How do we do that? The examiner asks the patient to keep the hand on the lower back. And against the examiner's resistance, the patient tries to lift it off. Right? That is what you call lift off test. And it is checking for the terminal internal rotation, which is the function of the subscapularis muscle. From the knee, I want you to remember the test of the ligaments, of the cruciate ligaments. They are the draw test, the anterior and the posterior draw test, which will be done in the knee flex to 90 degrees. I want you to remember the images for the Lashman test, which are done with the knee in 15 to 20 degrees of the knee flexion. I want you to remember the Epley's grinding test, which might be given to you, because Epley's grinding practically we might not be doing it. But the McMurray's test basically cannot be shown to you by the means of images. It can only be shown to you by the means of video, right? So these are the tests, all the tests, upper limb, thoracic outlet syndrome, Thompson test, the knee test. These are what I want you to remember. Other one which I want you to remember is a test which is done to assess the integrity of the abductor mechanism of the pelvic area. That is Trendelenburg test. That is Trendelenburg test. So why do we do Trendelenburg test? To check for the patency of the abductor mechanism. So gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus, and do remember they are getting a supply from not the inferior one, from the superior gluteal nerve. The gluteus medius and gluteus minimus, which are getting a supply from gluteus minimus, which are getting a supply from the superior gluteal nerve. Superior gluteal nerve. Remember this. So these are the tests which I want to discuss with you: the lift off, the Addison, the Roos, and one important one. How can we miss that? One test is about the carpal tunnel. So for carpal tunnel, do remember the most important 2 tests we have. Do remember the most important 2 tests we have for the carpal tunnel syndrome. What are the 2 most important tests we have for the carpal tunnel syndrome? What are the 2 most important tests we have for the carpal tunnel syndrome? They are one is what you call the Durkin test, the most sensitive test for the, this is the most sensitive test for the carpal tunnel. And then you have got the Phalen's test. So how do we do these tests? Durkin test will be like compression on the median nerve directly, right? And the Phalen's test will be like this, compression on the nerve. So this nerve is coming here, and when you flex the wrist, it will cause a compression of the nerve. So Durkin test or the Phalen's test. So these are different tests which I want you to remember. The Trendelenburg, carpal tunnel, drawer, Apley's, lift off, and others I said. Maybe there are multiple ways, as I've always said, that there are multiple ways to ask a particular thing from you, right? But the basic concept has to remain here, that what exactly they are asking me. There might be a language which is some 5 lines, 6 lines, 7 lines, hardly matters to me. But I know the basic, I know the crux, so I'll be easily able to crack it out. Okay. So these are the tests which I want you to remember. Now, next we have is the match the following type question, where you have to match the side A with side B. Now, in this side A with side B, I know that for you all, it is very, very simple. My whole idea behind this particular question to give you here was that you must remember the eponyms of different fractures. Now, there are 2 to 3 important topics from which the matching of side A with side B can be expected in your exam. One of them is the eponyms of the fractures, different fractures. Okay, so here you already know that pilon fracture is what? Pilon is bimalleolar fracture. Runner fracture is one which occurs in the fibula. Schoffer fracture is the one which is seen in the styloid of the radius. Cotton's is the one which is known as trimalleolar fracture. Comminuted intra-articular fracture of distal end of tibia is what we call the pilon's fracture. So I want you to recall all the important eponyms that we know, right? For example, when you want to revise your eponyms, you must start with your hand. Okay, what are the different eponyms we have? One, at the base of the first metacarpal, right? The Bennett and Rolando. Second, in the fifth metacarpal, here, the head, the Boxer's fracture, or at the base, the reverse Bennett fracture. So Bennett, Rolando, Boxer's and reverse Bennett. Moving here, distal radius, you have got Coley's, you have got Smith, you have got Schoffer, you have got Barton here. Correct? The four different, names of these fractures. You move up in the forearm, you have got Monteggia and you have got Galeazzi, right? You move up in the arm, here you have got Halston-Lewis fracture. Correct? When you move on to the lower limb, then you have the important things, the names of the fracture that you must remember. The Hoffa fracture from the femoral condyle, right? The Bumper's fracture from the tibial plateau. When you move on to the lower end of the tibia, you must remember these fractures: the pilon fracture, Cotton's fracture, the Maisonneuve fracture. What is that Maisonneuve fracture? So Maisonneuve fracture is the one in which we have a patient who has got fracture of the distal end of the tibia, the ankle area, intra-articular fracture of ankle with fracture proximal fibula, which can involve the common peroneal nerve, right? Then we have the pilon's fracture or the plafond fracture, which is an intra-articular fracture of the tibia, the ankle joint, right? Then we have got the, other than these fractures, the named fractures, there are multiple eponyms which are not very commonly asked, but these are the common ones which I just told you, right? So do remember the eponyms, and there is a long list of eponyms which I always share with you people, you guys on all the social media platform. If you don't have that list, just let me know. That's just one snap that I can share with you again if you want. Okay. Similarly, when you have matched side A with side B for the eponyms, what I want you to remember are the different angles which can be asked again as matching side A with side B. So what are the different angles which we should remember? One is Bowman's. Where do we see Bowman's? Bowman's is seen around elbow. Second is Cobb's angle. Where do we see Cobb's angle? It is seen in the spine in the cases of scoliosis. I hope that you all remember this. Then we can have certain angles in the neck of femur, which is known as the Powell's angle, the Powell's classification or the Powell's angle, right? Then we have the, the angles in the ankle area or the tarsal areas. One for the calcaneum specifically. For the calcaneum, we have got two angles, the angle of Gisane and the Boller's angle. Then when you talk about the CTEV, then again we have got most important angles which give you the idea of the cavus. For example, the Meyer angle. What is that Meyer angle? The lateral view in between the talus and the first metatarsal. Then we have got the talocalcaneal angle. We must remember. What is the name of this talocalcaneal angle? What do we call it? The Kite's angle. Right? And then we have the angle in CTV. If you talk about the angle in CTV, then you can talk about the tibiocalcaneal angle, which will give you the idea of the varus, right? The tibiocalcaneal angle for the equinus, right? And for the varus, obviously the talocalcaneal, it is going to give you the idea of the varus, Kite's angle for varus, right? And between the talus and same angle when it is seen in the AP view, it gives you the idea of the adduction. And for the equinus, as I said, between tibia and calcaneum. So do remember the angles, the commonly asked angles, the Gisane, the Bowlers, the Powells, the Cobbs, the Bowmans. These are the angles which are a part of your different, side A with side B match kind of questions. Then third important thing I want you to remember is the nerve, association of the nerves with different traumas. Which nerve will be involved in which particular site? Now, when you want to talk about the nerves at a particular site, we must remember, let's recall them very, very quickly. From here, starting from here, Piso-Hammett, the Guyon's canal, right? The ulnar nerve. Here, the median nerve. Then you have got in the forearm area, you have got 2 to 3 sites where you can have the compression of the nerves. One compression over here, the Caralgia parasitica, the superficial branch of the radial nerve, leading to sensory loss here on the dorsum of the first web space, right? Then pronator syndrome, under the pronator teres, you have got compression of the median nerve. Then you have got cubital tunnel syndrome, the compression of the ulnar nerve here beneath the medial epicondyle. The thoracic outlet syndrome, which I discussed with you. Then you have got injury of the radial nerve associated with the shaft of the humerus. And one we missed here, the PIN, which I already told you in the previous questions, the PIN leading to finger drop related to Monteggia fractures, right? So these many injuries in the upper limb. Okay, so shaft humerus, radial nerve, moving or more proximally, the head of the humerus involving the axillary nerve, right? Then when you go down, the dislocation of the hip joint leading to the involvement of the sciatic nerve. Coming anteriorly, the femoral vessels. Lower down, it can lead to involvement of the proximal tibia, the fibula basically can lead to involvement of the common peroneal nerve. Then lower down in the tarsal tunnel area, there can be compression of the tibial nerves. Then digital nerves getting compressed under the metatarsals, which is known as Morton's metatarsalgia, common around the second and third metatarsal heads, the Morton's metatarsalgia, the neural, what you can say, the digital nerves, right? So these are different nerves involved at different sites with different fractures, and we must remember the clinical presentation of these nerves, right? For example, the axillary will be having a problem of difficulty in abduction 15 to 90 and external rotation also. Okay, radial nerve, rest drop, isn't it? The supracondylar humeral area leading to AIN involvement, anterior interosseous nerve involvement leading to weakness of the pincer, the pinch mechanism, right? So supracondylar, Monteggia, finger drop, right? Other nerves, as they are injured, they can produce the clinical symptoms. So I want you to remember the fracture sites, which I just told, the nerves involved with those fracture site, and this can be another additional important MCQ for your exam, right? So nerves with fractures. So do remember, which I just mentioned. Okay. So when you just last thing in the nerves, when you talk about the median nerve, the carpal tunnel syndrome, any nerve, any fracture occurring here can be a reason for the compression of the median nerve. Any nerve getting compressed here can be a reason of the involvement of any fracture, can be a reason for the compression of the nerve here. For example, the Colles fracture, lunate dislocation, the scaphoid fracture, all of these three can lead to involvement of the median nerve. Okay. So nerves with the fracture, angles of the bones, and the eponyms of the fracture, these three important things, please do remember. Okay. So eponyms, angles, and nerves with fractures, the site along with the clinical implications, please do remember them. They are very important. Okay. Moving down to the next one. Which of the following is the probable damaged nerve in a patient with supracondylar humeral fracture who is unable to flex the IP joint of the thumb? So here, I know that IP joint of the thumb is being flexed by which nerve? The median nerve. Which branch of the median nerve? The anterior interosseous nerve. So anterior interosseous nerve is injured most commonly in which fractures? It is injured as a part of supracondylar injuries. So that is what we were just discussing. So we should know the site where the particular nerve may be injured, with which fracture particular nerve can be injured, right? So I have already told you the verbally only. So I don't think there is a need to write it. You already have revised it. So just kind of, revising the things very quickly. So these were the nerves which we just discussed now. And this particular question is just to tell you the idea that the nerve involvement with the fracture is very important. So don't expect that they will just simply write supracondylar, which nerve is gone. They will give you that there was a patient who is having an injury around the elbow. Now he is having a weakness of the pinch mechanism of these two fingers, right? So OK sign is not getting done perfectly. So that means AIN is gone. And if the AIN is gone, I know that the supracondylar is the region where the AIN is commonly injured. So try to link up the thing, try to link up the clinical scenario which has been given to you in your exam, right? Next, I have put question, removal of the vertebral disc can be done by all these approaches except. Now, purpose of putting this question here was very simple. It was just to, enroll you with the spine, right? There are two important topics from which the question has been asked frequently in your INI CT exam. One is spine and one is osteoporosis. So I want you to read these topics very thoroughly. All the fractures of the spine, Osteoporosis, all the MCQs of the osteoporosis, whether it is related to the clinical presentation, the X-rays, the treatment part, the investigation modalities, or the DEXA scan, which is being done for every patient after 65 years of age, recommended, for everyone after 65, mandatory for everybody after 65. Then in the spine, the, different kind of fractures, the regional conditions like scoliosis. Out of spine, the scoliosis is one of the most importantly, repeatedly asked topics. So please go with these two topics very, very thoroughly for your aims, at least from orthopedics point of view, have been asked repeatedly. Now coming on to this particular question, removal of the vertebral disc can be done by all of these approaches except. Now I want to highlight two important points here. This is your, vertebral body, the disc basically. We have removed the vertebral body. Lower one is visible. So this is the spinal cord area and these are the nerves which are getting out. So what we have done here, this area, that this area is what you call lamina, the spinous process, the transverse process, and the spinous process here. So spinous process, transverse process, the lamina. So what we have done, we have made or cut here in the lamina. That is laminectomy. So laminotomy is an opening, can be done to relieve the pressure on these nerves. Laminectomy, cutting it, can be done. Laminoplasty means a repairing of the lamina. So why would I like to go for lamina repair? No, lamina repair is not an option with us. Hemilaminectomy means only one part, only half the side of the lamina is being cut. So any of the possible options where we have to make a passage where the pressure on the nerve is relieved can be done, right? So we are cutting the lamina by laminotomy, laminectomy, hemilaminectomy, but not the plasty. Plasty is the repair. We don't do that. Another question that you should remember, whenever you are fixing a vertebra for scoliosis, for kyphosis, for any other problem, whenever you are fixing the vertebra, from where to pass the screw into the body of the vertebra. So there is only one possible way in which I can pass a screw into the body of vertebra, and that is through these areas which are connected to the vertebra. So I pass the screw directly from here like this. That's why, what area is this? This is our pedicle, the part which is connected to the body of the vertebra. So this is what you call pedicle, right? So that's why the screws are known as pedicle screws. So remember through which structure the screws will be passed in the body of the vertebra. So that will be pedicle. And that's why we call them the pedicle screws. Okay. So removal of the vertebral disc can be done by these all procedures. Screw is pedicle screw, which will be passed through the pedicle, right? So please go through the scoliosis and osteoporosis. In scoliosis, I would like you to remember, when you're talking about the spine, I would like you to remember from the scoliosis, every little bit of thing, the smallest of the thing. For example, what are the causes for scoliosis? So you know that for causes of scoliosis, it can be congenital cause or it can be a idiopathic cause. So when it is a congenital cause, you have to remember the conditions which can cause a congenital scoliosis. For example, the failure of the formation or the failure of the differentiation. The failure of formation or the failure of differentiation. Now do not expect, again I'm repeating, don't expect the theory, the failure of differentiation. They can just simply give you a X-ray. And they want you to identify what is the cause of scoliosis, whether it is congenital or it is idiopathic. So failure of formation means when the body of vertebra is not formed. So it can be a hemivertebra, only half formed vertebra, or it can be a wedge shaped vertebra or a hemivertebra. What is the meaning of failure of differentiation? When the two vertebral bodies, they have failed to separate from each other, and that is known as block vertebra. So you should know the causes. You should know how they are looking on the X-rays. You should know that if a child is coming to you or an adolescent is coming to you, how you are going to treat it, by what braces, whether it is Milwaukee brace or it is a Rizer's cast or it is a Boston brace, what kind of brace you are going to use for the scoliotic deformity, the angle, which I told you, the Cobb's angle, which we have discussed earlier also in the name of scoliosis. So scoliosis and porosis are two most important topics which have been repeated frequently in your last few years of the exams of INI-CET. Right? So please do remember these two important topics. Okay. Now, another question, another topic which I want you to focus on is infections. So, an 8-year-old child presents with fever and wound with discharging sinus, the pus from the right thigh for last 4 months. Given below is the X-ray which is labeled with a labeled structure. Identify. So, what they are trying to label? So when they're saying there is a pus discharge, it simply means that now it is a sinus, and sinus we know is a part of chronic osteomyelitis. From the topic of chronic osteomyelitis, I want you to remember what is the commonest organism for which kind of myelitis? Staph overall, Pseudomonas for the patients who are taking the, let me just put it down. One, the organisms. So most common overall, it will be Staph aureus. Parenteral, drugs, Pseudomonas. IV, parenteral therapy, to whom the parenteral therapy is being given, the fungal, the sickle cell hemoglobinopathies, it will be Salmonella. So organisms you must remember. Second, the best way to diagnose the infection, it will be aspiration. It will be aspiration, or it will be culture and sensitivity. So aspiration, culture and sensitivity. Number 3, I want you to remember that in case of chronic osteomyelitis, the every bit of detail about how the sequestrum looks like, how the involucrum looks like, how the cloaca will look like, or how this is the dead body, sequestrum. This all whiteness around the dead body will be known as the involucrum. Cloaca will be an opening in the involucrum, and sinus will be an opening into the skin. Right? So these are the 4 things I want you to remember. Okay. Fourth, the complications of chronic osteomyelitis. So remember, the most common complication for chronic osteomyelitis, it will be recurrence, acute exacerbation. We don't call it recurrence because it doesn't go away anytime. So it is acute exacerbations. It is acute exacerbations. Okay, fine. So organism, aspiration, sequestrum, involucrum, complications, and something special in relation to the chronic osteomyelitis, that is paprika sign. That is paprika sign. What is that paprika sign? When you keep on curating out the chronic osteomyelitis, the sequestrum, when the normal bone comes, how will you come to know the normal bone has come? It is by bleeding points. It is by bleeding points. Okay, so that is paprika sign. So chronic osteomyelitis, these are all the important points that I want you to remember from chronic osteomyelitis. The picture of this, it is very, very important to, it may not be a very classical, image here, but you must be aware how the things are seen in chronic osteomyelitis. Then we have the next one I have kept for you is from the joint conditions, and I want you to remember the important highlighted features of all the joint arthropathies. For example, if I take the joint conditions, number 1, OA, I want you to remember from OA that in the hand there will be Hubbardin or the Bouchard's notes, right? Then I want you to remember that in OA, in what all conditions the high tibial osteotomy is not to be done. Then I want you to remember the medical management, the glucosamine. Then I want you to remember the glucosamine, Hylase, hyaluronidase for managing it conservatively. Okay. Then I want you to remember the most important muscle involved in OA, that is quadriceps. So these are 3 to 4 things I want you to remember from OA. Second, when you move from RA, I want you to remember every bit of detail about RA. Involvement of the wrist, non-involvement of the DIP and the vertebrae except the C1 and C2. The deformities related, the wrist subluxation, that is Z deformity, the swan neck, the bottonia, then the triple deformity of the knee, hallux valgus deformity, right, atlantoaxial subluxation. These are all a part of rheumatoid. Then I want you to remember that when you go for the investigation part, the patient will be anemic, anemia of the chronic disease, right, normocytic, normochromic. Then about this rheumatoid factor, it is not specific. NT-CCP, which will be used for diagnosis. In the treatment part, I want you to remember the complication of all the drugs, right? Complication of drugs related to rheumatoid arthritis. Please do remember, including your methotrexate, including your hydroxychloroquine, sulfasalazine, and all the other biologicals, right? Please do remember the complication of the drugs. Number 3, from ankylosing spondylitis, I want you to remember the joint involved, the sacroiliac. I want you to remember the bamboo spine. I want you to remember the pump handle test, the Ganselin test. I want you to remember the Schauber's test for ankylosing spondylitis, right? So the tests are very, very important. Plus the X-ray, that is bamboo spine. Fourth, from psoriatic arthritis, I want you to remember one only classical feature, that is pencil in cup appearance. Number 5, from neuropathic point of view, I want you to remember that which joint is involved in which condition. For example, when I talk of diabetes, it will involve the intertarsal joint. When I talk of syphilis, Tabes dorsalis, that involves the knee. When I talk of leprosy, it involves the IP joint of the hands. Okay. When I talk about the gout and the pseudogout, I want you to remember that the gout will be involving your first metatarsal with severe pain and swelling and inflammatory features. On the other hand, the pseudogout will be involving the knee joint. And the best way to diagnose both of them will be aspiration, right? Not the serum uric acid level. It will be aspiration. In gout, you are going to find the monosodium urate crystal. In pseudogout, you are going to find the CPPD crystals. And as a part of hemophilic arthropathy, I want you to remember that in hemophilic arthropathy, the most commonly involved joint is again knee. Iliopsoas will be the muscle, and in the complicated cases, untreated cases, the deformity seen will be a triple deformity of the knee. Right? This is all I want you to remember. So this is a pretty simple image, that is ankylosing spondylitis. Right? So please remember all these important points which I just said, we just revised in a 5-minute span of time for joints. I have this last question, but yes, again a very, very important repeatedly asked question is compartment syndrome. Right? So compartment syndrome, the earliest sign of the compartment syndrome will be pain on the passive stretch, and you must be very, very vigilant. About compartment syndrome, you must be aware that when do we call it a compartment syndrome? When there is a raise in pressure in a closed osteofacial compartment. How much is the pressure should be raised? More than 30 millimeters of mercury. Right? More than 30 millimeters of mercury. So there are devices which can measure it. Which is the most common fracture which can produce compartment syndrome? It is fracture midshaft of tibia. That is fracture diaphysis tibia. That is fracture diaphysis of tibia is the most commonly involved fracture related to compartment syndrome. In the upper limb, which is the most commonly involved muscle showing you the deformities because of compartment syndrome, it is flexor digitorum profundus, most commonly involved, leading to VIC, is Walkman's ischemic contracture. Right? In the cases of compartment syndrome, the earliest symptom will be pain, and the sign, the most important sign will be passive stretching, or you can say the passive pain on passive movement of the limb. Now, this question has been asked to you in multiple ways. For example, they can ask you that which of these conditions, given condition is an emergency for the orthopedic surgeon to come immediately and see the patient, and the condition mentions are open fracture, intra-articular fracture, pain on passive stretch. So we know pain on passive stretch is a sign of compartment syndrome. We have to call the orthopedic surgeon immediately, right? And then whenever you are treating a case of compartment syndrome, please do remember that as a part of treatment of compartment syndrome, we have to go for fasciotomy. It is involvement that you have to cut the fascia, has to be the superficial as well as the deep fascia. You have to cut, incise both the fascias to relieve the pressure. Okay. So superficial plus deep fascia has to be incised. Right. So do remember these important topics. And other than that, obviously the topics like fat embolism syndrome, their clinical presentation, is again very, very important. The osteochondritis or the avian, the Kienbock's disease, the Kohler's disease, Sever's disease, tractional osteochondritis. These are again important from AIIMS point of view, the INI CET point of view. So these were the questions that I wanted to discuss with you. In a very short span of time, I do believe that we have been able to revise a lot of content, a lot of important MCQs, and I'm very much sure by this time you're already very, very much prepared for the exam. So I wish you all the very best, and I do believe that you are going to, give your best shot in this exam, and definitely you are going to get a best result for this particular INI CET exam. So my best wishes, guys. Do your best in this particular exam, right? So thank you so much, and do well. And for any kind of other assistance you want me from orthopedic point of view or academic assistance, do let me know, right? So thank you so much. All the very best.